Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos ao Centro Cultural do Bem e a este ciclo de conversas com história, e com história. É um prazer receber-vos aqui. O meu nome é Raquel Varela, eu sou historiadora, professora na Universidade Nova de Lisboa, investigadora também do Instituto de História de Amsterdão. E a ideia deste ciclo é nós fazermos aquilo que se chama história pública, é conquistarmos a esfera pública com discussões que normalmente ou muitas vezes estão fechadas na academia ou num mundo intelectual muito especializado. Então nós quisemos trazer neste ciclo, que vai ter 6 convidados, o economista Michael Roberts, o diretor do Instituto de Sociologia da Universidade de Viena, Klaus Dorre, que vai falar sobre a Europa. Vamos ter também Dom Carlos Azevedo sobre a Igreja e o Património, o professor Roberto Lera, que é reitor da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Enfim, vocês depois poderão acompanhar na programação e são muito bem-vindos. É realmente um prazer receber-vos. Cumprimento também algumas caras conhecidas que estão aqui e quero agradecer a todos no CCB que contribuíram para nós conseguirmos realizar este ciclo, que são pessoas absolutamente extraordinárias que me têm acompanhado, auxiliado neste lugar maravilhoso. Ao meu lado, vocês têm o economista Michael Roberts. O Michael dá-me a honra de ser meu amigo e nós conhecemos-nos porque eu comecei há uns anos a consultar o blog dele. E o blog dele, que se chama The Next Recession, tornou-se, nos meios da crítica da economia política, talvez hoje o blog mais lido a nível mundial mesmo, eu diria. O interessante do seu blog é que ele consegue ter discussões extremamente complexas do campo da economia, que são muito pedagógicas e educativas para não especialistas e ao mesmo tempo extraordinariamente antidogmáticas. Portanto, se vocês forem ao blog vão encontrar uma discussão extremamente afável e delicada, mas sem medo de questionar os seus opositores, sem medo do contraditório. Frequentemente o Michael coloca uma premissa e coloca imediatamente quem são os autores que estão contra e porque é que eles estão contra, elencando conceptualmente. Portanto, o blog transpira honestidade intelectual. E nós começámos a trocar e-mails, conhecemos-nos em várias conferências. Entretanto, eu trato-o por Bob carinhosamente, porque, na verdade, Michael Roberts é o pseudónimo utilizado no blog. Publicou 3 livros sobre a atualidade de Marx e sobre aquilo que ele chama a longa depressão, portanto a crise de 2008, e eu vou-lhe fazer também perguntas sobre isto. Se alguém não estiver à vontade com o inglês, eu posso tentar fazer uma pequena súmula. Preferem que eu o faça? Estão aqui a abanar a cabeça que sim. O meu inglês tem uma vantagem, é o chamado broken English. Não é um inglês britânico, e o Michael também se esforça para fazer.
My excellent Portuguese will manage.
So, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us and give us the opportunity to learn with you a little bit of what this strange science, economy. What is economy, Michael?
Yes, well, I must apologize for speaking in English. I know that Portuguese and Spanish were the languages of the world, if we're talking about history, in the 16th century. But now the language of the world is American, and soon to be Indian, I think, a form of English which is taking over from the British English. And thinking about languages and why that one becomes dominant is also to do with which is the dominant economy in the world. And what do we mean by an economy, Raquel? Well, it is the production of things, the consumption of things and services that people do. So people spend their day making things or providing services. They spend some of their day consuming those things and consuming those services, and the other bit sleeping, but also that involves a level of production too for the beds and other things involved. And the economy then is that, and the economics is the study of economies to understand what is going on, the process of production, the process of consumption, how that production is distributed amongst us all, and how we receive it, what the role of governments are in playing an intervention or a role in economies. And that's the study, that's what economics studies. And it's interesting to note, Raquel, that the word economy and economics is really only quite new, 250 years at maximum, before the word appears in the language of any country. And that's precisely because we had quite a considerable change in the nature of countries and how they organize their social life and how they organize their production and their consumption. And that change was a change in the way in which economies are run and organized by human beings. And that started only 250 years ago. Those economies, the modern economy that we're in now, which I like to call, and others do, capitalism, it was a very young thing. It's not, before that, was completely different forms of organization of economies, slave economies, serf economies. In Asia, absolute monarchy economies where people worked until they dropped dead. Those sorts of economies have been replaced by this modern capitalist economy. I say it's modern because it's, as we're talking about history, it's only 250 years old. And that economy is a completely different way of organizing society from the previous ones. And that is when economics starts becoming a social science to study this new form of economy and what it means for the way that we organize our lives.
Thank you, Michael. I'll make a very short resume in Portuguese.
Okay.
Essencialmente, o que ele disse é que a economia é como nós produzimos bens e serviços na sociedade, e o estudo da economia é um estudo muito recente porque vem associado ao desenvolvimento do capitalismo. Tem 250 anos. Portanto, há aqui uma analogia associada a uma associação entre economia e capitalismo. But, Michael, nowadays, when we say economy, everybody would speak about business or would think about business. That yes. Economy is the same as business, is it?
Well, it's not the same as business in my view, but it's understandable that people would consider economy to do with business because the operation of the modern economy, or the capitalist economy, is production for profit, for making money. We are in a making money economy. It's not an economy which produces for things people need. People no longer produce things that they need themselves and make them themselves using their own equipment and their own house or their own land. Now, most of us, 99% of us, go into an office or into a warehouse or into a shop or into a factory, and we produce things that we don't actually consume ourselves. We probably only produce a tiny bit in some places of the thing that makes up, say, a whole motor car. And then for that, we get money. And the owner of the factory, the warehouse, the shop, whatever service it is, they own the factory, they own the means of production, to use the economic term, and they therefore sell the products and make the profit. They control the profit and then decide whether they're going to employ us for the next day, the next week, the next year, or whether they're going to give us a contract at all. And they decide whether the process of production continues. This is a money-making economy, completely different from all the economies we've had previously.
Então, há uma associação entre economia e negócios, porque na economia capitalista a produção é destinada ao lucro. É uma economia destinada a fazer dinheiro e não à produção de necessidades. Nesta economia capitalista caracteriza-se pela separação entre produtor e consumidor. Raramente nós consumimos o que produzimos e o contrário também é verdade. Raramente há uma associação entre produção e consumo. E também não há uma associação entre a propriedade dos meios de produção e quem produz. Há uma separação. But Michael, capitalism is probably the most success mode of production if we compare with other ones. We have never been so developed as a society, scientific, technological, etc., after the Industrial Revolution and the capitalist mode of production, compared to for example, to the feudal system. So what I wanted to ask you is, why such a system that is so productive, that reach such development, produces the biggest crisis that humankind has seen? So 870 in 19th century, the 29 crisis, the 70 crisis, and the 2008 crisis that you call the Long Depression. Why a system like this, so developed compared to other ones, produces such miserable situations in the crisis times?
Well, I think your first point is very important. Capitalism, this modern economy, has never been so successful in raising the level of living standards for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people across the world. Just think, in the last 250 years, major diseases have been wiped out across the world. Malaria, on the whole, other major diseases. Do you remember in the period before capitalism, there were plagues and famines on a regular basis? That we still have famines in the poorest parts of the world, but plague has been wiped out. The conditions, the medical conditions have changed, and we can measure this. We economists measure this by the life expectancy. Whereas 100 years ago, the average life expectancy was, say, 55. Now the average life expectancy is 75. And if you eat sushi and live in Japan, it's 85. So there is a very high increase in life expectancy. And the levels of income have changed, so that we sit in a room like this with electricity, with heating, with air conditioning, if it works, and we have a completely different environment from people had 250 years ago. We have perhaps one of the most important things that often people forget. We have proper sewage. From the period of the end of the Roman Empire to about the 18th century, there was no sewage, and no wonder there was so much cholera and other terrible things. Sewage, water treatment, this is a major change. Now, is that due to capitalism? Well, clearly it's due to the drive to raise production, to use science, to improve the conditions, to make things work better. But so that side of capitalism is a fantastic change. If I had a graph to show you of production, this is the world from about 1,000, 10,000, 15,000, 1,700, and then zzz. Once capitalism started, production has rocketed. So many economists, what I call the mainstream economists, say, well, there you are, everything is fine. But there are other sides, the dark side of capitalism, and that is, first of all, massive inequality in the world. Only this week, Oxfam, the international charity, announced that as the very rich and famous people went to Davos in Switzerland in their private jets and their limousines to discuss the problems of the world, that 26 families had more wealth, more personal wealth, than 50% of 7 billion population. So 3.5 billion people in this world have less wealth than 26 people. Most of them are Americans, but few elsewhere. That shows you the inequality of wealth. And this situation is getting worse, so that countries that are very poor, like sub-Saharan Africa and other places, are getting further and further behind from countries, even countries like Portugal, who can also see a gap between where we are and say, where Germany is. So there are huge inequalities between countries that are not getting less. There is one country that has changed that, that's China, which has dramatically raised 800 million people out of poverty to a reasonable standard of living over the last 30 years. But otherwise, the inequalities between countries remain, and within countries, they are massive. In the United States, the top 0.1% of the population owns or gets income worth 30%. So that 0.1%, by the way, is probably about 200,000 people have as much income in their pockets over a year as 30% of the 300 million Americans.
Can I interrupt
that shows you how the
1
inequality has gone. I see I can go on too long.
No. I wanted to ask you, what is the life expectancy if you eat British food?
Well, it's not such a joke, because we know that British food, German food, Northern European food, which is high in fat content, and chips, and things of this nature, the life expectancy there is not as good as it is in, surprisingly, you might think, in supposedly poorer Mediterranean countries like Portugal, Greece, and Italy, and so on. A very interesting fact, Raquel, is that economists have just found out that while life expectancy has been rising in most countries for the last 100 years, in the last 10 years, in the United States, life expectancy is falling. For the first time in the United States, life expectancy is falling because of the huge inequalities, the relative poverty that exists a whole layer of Americans, particularly Americans aged between 45 and 60 who are out of work, who are now on opioids, drugs, to quell their depression. These elements are dying, and it's not. This is the decline in life expectancy in supposedly the most wealthy country in the world, which is another indication, in my view, of the dark side of capitalism.
I want to go back to inequality, but let me just make a short resume of your ideas. Então, o Michael acabou de referir que o capitalismo é um sucesso do ponto de vista do aumento da produtividade e da incorporação da ciência e da tecnologia ao aumento da produção e da produtividade, e que isso tem uma expressão muito óbvia no aumento da esperança média de vida nos últimos 100 anos. Ele refere também, e acabou de referir, que há tendências de retrocesso, como a queda na esperança média de vida nos últimos 10 anos nos Estados Unidos, que é o país, portanto, o país mais rico do mundo, onde não seria expectável, mas que um dos lados tenebrosos do capitalismo é o aumento da desigualdade e da concentração de riqueza. Essa desigualdade é uma desigualdade entre países e dentro de países. E em todos eles tem aumentado a desigualdade, com exceção da China. E é o que eu vou falar agora com ele particularmente, é sobre isto, porque, como vocês sabem, há uma polémica entre os economistas se, com os dados que o Michael acabou de apresentar da Oxfam, que esta semana tornou público que 26 pessoas detêm uma riqueza pessoal equivalente a 50% da humanidade, como é que estes dados são compatíveis com a estatística geral de que a desigualdade a nível mundial está a diminuir. Esta é uma das grandes questões, e há um outro economista com quem o Michael dialoga muito, o Milanovic, que é bastante conhecido, onde estas questões são colocadas. Michael, I was about to ask you how these inequality figures showed by Oxfam can be justified with the general statistic that says that the world is less equal than it was. It's this statistic true, and why it is true, and how these figures come along
Well, I think the audience should have a health warning at this point, a statistical health warning. Economists, not just economists, but particularly economists, play with statistics, and they will present one statistic with you, and then another one, and it will appear to be the opposite. And so you are told one day that there's 26 families that have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world, and then somebody else will say, well, actually, poverty is getting less, and the inequality between countries is declining. Now, the answer to the question is, of both those questions and both those statistics, is they're both right. Oh, it's a problem. How do we resolve this question? Well, yes, if we look at the personal wealth of individuals, then there's a very high inequality between the very top and the poor people. If I look around this room, 50, 60 people, you are in, now you may not believe this, you are in the top 10% of the world's personal wealth. You are the top 10% richest people in the world. Did you know that? Why is this? Because 3.5 billion people in the world have absolutely no wealth at all. That is the sharp contrast that we see. Now, the other side of the argument was global poverty is getting less. The World Bank has published a figure to show that has a diagram which shows the world poverty here. I won't give you the exact ratios, going down like this over the last 20 years in particular. Why? 2 reasons. They define poverty originally as $1 a day. If you earned less than $1 a day, you were poor. If you earned $1.50 a day, you weren't poor, according to the World Bank. Somebody said to them, this is a very low figure. This does not seem right. So they raised it to $1.90 a day. That's the current World Bank definition. As a result, 300 million people are no longer poor by changing this figure. And then somebody else said, well, actually, if you're really, I think it should be $5 a day. So there's the economists arguing about the actual figure to define poverty. Poverty in economic terms isn't always the same thing as what we mean by day-to-day poverty, all the other things and problems that we have. But if we're going to talk about what you live on per day, that's what the World Bank says. And if you use that figure, then poverty has come down. But as I said to Raquel, as we said just earlier, the reason is that there are 800 million Chinese who are no longer at that level of poverty. They have dramatically risen their levels because of the tremendous growth in China of people coming out of the countryside and moving into the cities and getting jobs to work 24 hours a day for Foxconn to make our Apple phones, but they're getting a much bigger wage to do so than they were sitting in the countryside starving. So it's been a transformation in China which has changed the level of poverty in China according to the World Bank figures, and therefore changes the figures. So you can see that statistics can be used any way you like if you want to get a result. I leave you to consider what is the reality of this, and that is what a lot of us spend the time doing, analysing the figures, analysing the evidence, and trying to come up with a reason or a conclusion about whether things are getting worse or better, whether things are getting more unequal or not. But we have to say that it's very difficult to argue against the facts that things are getting more unequal within countries in like Portugal and the United States, France, and so on. They are getting more unequal by any measure. Whether there are more people who are no longer in poverty is a matter of how you measure it.
Então, o que ele essencialmente disse é que todas estas estatísticas são verdadeiras, mas depende do olhar analítico que nós temos. A distribuição da riqueza nos países está a ficar mais desigual, não interessa sob que prisma se olhe. A questão é o número de pessoas que oficialmente saem da pobreza porque se usa uma medida que era de $1, que é uma medida do Banco Mundial, depois passou para $1,50 para $1,90. E muitos economistas calculam que, ele não disse isto, estou eu a acrescentar, é preciso pelo menos $5 por dia para sair daquilo que seria a verdadeira pobreza. Portanto, ao se mudar o nível da pobreza, em Portugal, por exemplo, nós utilizamos muito os valores da OCDE que associam ao salário médio. Isto significa que, como em Portugal o salário médio caiu depois de 2008, o número de pessoas que saiu da pobreza oficialmente diminuiu, porque o salário médio caiu, ou seja, não há nenhuma alteração estatística, o que há é uma alteração na medição dessa estatística. À parte disso, ele chamou também a atenção para um país onde realmente a desigualdade diminuiu, que é a China, porque a China operou uma transformação clássica de transformação de camponeses em assalariados e de onde saíram de campos, no campo onde estavam em situação miserável, para um salário, ainda que baixo, bastante superior, porque em média, quando há processos de industrialização, a produtividade aumenta para 4, só pelo facto de sair-se do campo para a cidade, que foi o que aconteceu em Portugal nos anos 60, isto também estou eu a acrescentar, mas não há dúvida nenhuma que na China estes números alteram a estatística a nível mundial. Há, de facto, na China, não só em termos da medição da pobreza, mas concretamente uma diminuição da desigualdade. E a pergunta que eu lhe vou fazer é como é que a China chega, o que é a China hoje, o que é que ela representa, porque também, como sabem, há uma grande polémica nos economistas sobre se a China é uma semicolónia dos Estados Unidos que não tem independência tecnológica e científica, que não tem controle sobre a sua moeda, porque os depósitos dos empresários norte-americanos têm que ser protegidos e, por outro lado, há vários economistas que dizem que não, senhora, nós já estamos a falar de um semi-imperialismo ou de um imperialismo regional que tem uma capacidade científica, tecnológica e até bélica para se enfrentar, por exemplo, com os Estados Unidos, e muitos colocam em cima da mesa, inclusive a hipótese que esta competição desencadeie uma guerra. E, portanto, justamente o que eu lhe vou perguntar é o que é isto da China, que continua para ser, para todos nós, para mim, certamente uma incógnita. I wanted to ask you about China. There is this polemic if China is a semi-colony or a semi-imperialistic state. If it is, if they have no control over technology, science, and military sectors, and the coin, because the dollars that are put in China by the U.S. companies cannot be used in a regular basis as other coins, or if we are speaking already of a regional imperialism that can develop and be a competitor to US, and in the limit, a possibility of a political war from this economic competition. So could you tell us a little bit about China?
This is a frightening thought Raquel presents to us, that we're heading for a third world war between China and the United States as a possibility. Let us think, if we're thinking about conversations in history, let us go back and think about how modern economies haven't developed all at the same rate and the same level. Anybody who lives in Portugal knows that they haven't developed under capitalism in the same way the United States has. There is a massive difference between the size of that country and Portugal's size and its output and its wealth. If we go back to the beginning of capitalism, if we want to take that 250 years ago, then the major powers towards the end of the 18th century were France and England. And after the wars and the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars, in the period of the 19th century, England was, or Britain, as it prefers to be called, to include Scotland, Wales, and a little bit of Ireland, became the hegemonic power, to use that phrase, the dominant economic power in the world. And it ruled the waves, it was the manufacturing center of the world, it became the finance center of the world, it was able to spread its wings with a big empire through India and other countries. Previous countries that had empires, like Portugal had, Spain had, France has had, most of those had given way to the British Empire during the 19th century. But that did not last. Soon there were growing other powers who developed their economies, developed their factories, developed better technology, in particular Germany and in particular the United States, after the Civil War in the United States defeated the slave-owning states and abolished slavery. That allowed industrial United States to develop. And by the time we get to the First World War, it is not clear who is the main power in the world anymore. It is a battle between Britain, between the old power, and France, the old power in Europe, the United States, the big power from across the Atlantic, and Germany in Europe now becoming a powerful force, which is probably part of the reason the First World War began, because it became a struggle between these powers to dominate economically and politically around the world. And the Second World War is a continuation of that, because it wasn't resolved by the First World War. It continued during the 20s and 30s, particularly something we have perhaps time to discuss after the Great Depression and a crisis in capitalism. But in the period after 1945, it is clear who is the dominant economic and political power in the world. It is the United States, Pax Americana. They set the American peace. They established the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, all these organizations which were dominated by America, with occasional alliance with the Europeans. And the Europeans then attempted to build a counter-empire, a counter-grouping in the European nations, eventually through the common market and eventually the European Union. But now, as we enter the 21st century, there is a new economic power on the scene, and this is China, which is the manufacturing center of the world now. Not Britain, not the United States, not even Germany. It is China, a massive manufacturing power that exports. I don't know what you're wearing, I don't know what's in your handbags, but I can assure you that there's something Chinese on you or around you at this moment, and I suspect there is probably absolutely nothing British that you have on you at the moment, as far as, unless you have a weapon. It seems that Britain only makes weapons now, or drugs to make you feel a little bad.
Sorry.
Ah,
okay.
Are you sure? You mean they're made in England? Oh, it's a brand English, is it? Churches. It's probably made in China. Or Italy. Clark's. Yeah, well, maybe. Marks and Spencer's, which is a big British brand name for shop, used to say, we make everything in Britain. Everything. We got our clothes, it's all made in Britain. Food is sourced in Britain. I don't know how they explain bananas, but never mind. They said it was all British. Now, in 2019, hardly anything is sourced in Britain, even in Marks and Spencer's, which shows you the change. Gold helped Brexit. We'll come to that later. But now China is the big rival power to America. And what are the Americans' reaction? They wish to isolate China, block its trade, say they are stealing technology from Europe and the United States, which of course they are. Whoever did not do that in the powers over the last 200 years of capitalism? The Americans did it, the Germans did it, the British did it. Now it's the Chinese turn to steal the technology, turn it around and make it even better than it was before. And that is something the Americans cannot expect. They cannot allow, because they want to remain the dominant power in the greatest country in the world. So this rivalry is now building up, and this is going to be the big issue of the 21st century. I'll finish, Raquel, just making a couple of points here. That it's not absolutely sure who will win this battle in economic power. China has 1.5 billion people, but now it is getting older. The working population, the people able to work between 16 and 64, this year has stopped growing. So now, just like us in Portugal or in Britain, people are getting older, they're not working, and the working part of the population is getting smaller in relation to those people who are older. And so that I can sit back while the rest of the British workforce are working very hard, while I relax at this meeting. In China, that situation, there's been very young people who have kept things going, the same in India, but now, for the first time, China is getting older. So it is entering the same situation that the United States has been in for 50 years, and Europe has been in similarly. So this is going to change the balance of how quick China grows in relation to the United States. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but it is going to be the key issue. Will this lead to a war, like we saw in the 20th century, 2 world wars? Well, I can say I hope not, and I think probably not, because now, what is the big difference this time? This time wars, yes, we can be small wars. We see them in Afghanistan and Iraq. I call them small wars. It's only 2 or 3 million people killed. The United States doesn't consider that very important. It could be wars in the region between, little short wars between Korea and China, maybe over who owns what island and that sort of thing. But a world war where 2 great powers have nuclear weapons and all kinds of other weapons of mass destruction, not financial ones, but real ones, that situation would mean the annihilation of human race, of everything society. I don't think, even now, in China or the United States under Trump, we have madmen who want to go that far yet. So on that hope that we don't elect or appoint, or madmen don't come to power who have no compunction about nuclear war, then I think a war is unlikely.
Vou ter que fazer assim uma coisa muito breve, porque eu ainda tenho 3 perguntas que não quero deixar de perguntar, mas sim, eu considero que a China é a grande novidade em termos de potências no século XXI. que há uma incógnita neste momento que é a chamada anemia demográfica ou tendência à escassez de força de trabalho, que acontece em todos os países à medida que vão passando do campo, os trabalhadores do campo para a cidade. Como vocês sabem, existe uma espécie de lei da demografia que diz que não há todos os métodos até hoje para aumentar a taxa de fertilidade nos países urbanos falharam, nas sociedades urbanas falharam. Portanto, a população das Chinas também está a envelhecer e como a China é baseada na manufatura, em capital intensivo e a utilização de grande força de trabalho, essa é uma incógnita que está em cima da mesa e que uma guerra é altamente improvável, uma guerra direta entre a China e os Estados Unidos, porque são duas potências nucleares, o que levaria a um choque catastrófico, não é? A aniquilação mútua. You were speaking about Brexit.
Oh dear.
Do you know, I think the British Parliament, I see this as a movie series because I love
Unfortunately, yes.
No, but it's lovely. You have to recognize that order. It's absolutely delicious.
You say order when there is disorder. Yeah.
Yes. What happened in England?
This is a very, very sad, depressing joke that the British people, the British government and the British Parliament and Britain is now a sad joke. I thought it was just Trump's America, but now it is also Britain's Brexit. And this situation is making it more seriously, is also a situation of history. We have to think about the history. What is the history which we discussed before, which is in the 19th century, Britain was the great economic and political power. They had the big empire. They were top dog. They could decide what goes on in the world. And a whole layer of the ruling parts of the British society, inheriting all the way down, many of them still are aristocrats, but also big business people and so on, they hanker after this old time of the empire. There's that element as well. What has happened, of course, in the 20th century was that Britain became not a major economic power anymore, but it still was a major financial power. The City of London was a dominant financial sector along with New York around the world. And the businesses of the City of London are international businesses. They are international banks. And all the businesses that operate calling themselves British are actually international companies that work around the world and make most of their profits elsewhere, not in Britain. This element of British society does not want to leave the European Union. They see the advantages of the European Union with its no tariffs, the ability to export capital and move people around as they please with no restrictions as a big advantage, and they want to operate inside that European Union. But as I say, the other half of the people who want to think about this, particularly people in small towns in Britain who don't do international business, but merely got a coffee shop or run a chain of hairdressers or whatever, these people don't want to leave the European Union, partly because they think, well, Britain's go back to an empire and will be better, partly because they think that there's too many regulations on how many people they can employ, what hours they've got to work, the taxes they have to pay, and they've been told that this is all due to the European Union. And it's the European Union's fault that we have these regulations. I just make two economic points on this. Britain is the most deregulated economy in Europe. We have the least amount of restrictions on health and safety, on labour rights, on trade union rights, we don't have any, on ability to work all sorts of hours and conditions and contracts. We are the most deregulated economy in Europe. Yet there's a whole section of people, small businesses, who think the EU is regulating them and they've got to leave. The reason that the EU does some regulations is partly because the British government participated with the French and German governments to introduce whatever it was. We hear in Britain sometimes in the past, in the wild newspapers, that the EU has regulated that all bananas should be straight in Britain. Even though it's naturally impossible, they should be straight, and if they're not, they can't be sold. This was presented as evidence, not only in the campaign, but prior to this, because there's a desire to whip up antagonism to the EU and its regulations. After the vote, which was 52 to 48 to leave, 52 to 48, not a wild difference. After that, there was a radio show, and they asked all the people who voted to leave to come on. Now, some of the people who voted to leave said that they didn't want all these Eastern Europeans coming into the country. And so there's a certain racist or nationalist feel about immigration. But a lot of the others didn't say that at all, although the argument often presented on that is, well, it uses up all the resources of public services and health and so on, and education, and there's no room for our kids at school and things of that sort. Of course, you might ask, why aren't there enough schools with decent conditions and places for everybody? And the fact is that all the immigrants that have come into Britain in the last 10 years in particular have paid more taxes out than they've got in benefits and services, because they're young people working hard paying taxes. They're not old people like me sitting back enjoying themselves while I get a barista from a Polish worker. But there's that feeling that they're using up the resources. But the other thing is of the regulations. So they ask these people, why you want to leave the EU? Because of the EU regulations. So the presenter on the radio said, well, name me one EU regulation that you didn't like. They didn't know what the regulation was that they didn't like. It was just this idea that the EU was regulating them, and that therefore, if they were outside the EU, suddenly Britain would be like it was in the 19th century, or at least in the 1950s, when we had bad food, chips, and all the other things, which we had no central heating in the 1950s, nothing. It was terrible, but I prefer to go back to the 1970s myself, when we had the Beatles and so on. That was a bit better. But the idea of going back to the empire in the 1950s, this idea appears to just partly because, and then we'll perhaps talk about this, the last 10 years have been hard for the majority of working people in all countries of Europe. Hard after the recession and the long depression. Conditions have not... Unemployment may have come down, but incomes haven't risen, taxes are worse, public services are worse, and the whole layer of people who have been, used the phrase, left behind, although the others have actually gone forward, but that's another matter. These people who have been left behind feel left behind, and they're antagonistic towards the City of London and the British government and so on, who've done nothing for them. And now, when they had an opportunity to stick it to them with a vote, just a sufficient number went down that road. So now what happens? They knew what they did. They knew they wanted to leave the EU, but then the politicians, the ruling groups, said, well, what terms are we going to leave on the EU? We have no idea. Nobody knows what we're going to do.
But Michael, I have to ask you this.
Yeah.
You're saying that this opposition against the EU were coming from the working class or the middle class after proletarianization, after the crisis. But the Brexit is a bourgeoisie idea.
Yes.
So how...
Well, there are two groups of people, in my opinion, who voted for Brexit in Britain. The two groups are the people in the north and the small towns who have had nothing and their public services are down. But if you look at the votes in those areas, there were majorities to leave, not big majorities. So that means that ordinary working people in those areas wanted to vote for Brexit. The other big group that voted for Brexit is in the south of England, in the big rich areas, who have Union Jacks on their houses and salute when the Queen goes past. And that empire image, I know in Portugal you don't have a monarch, but you have to understand that it brings in money. We are told Buckingham Palace is a big money maker. I'm not sure that that's a very good argument for having a monarchy, but it's often presented to me as though Lisbon can't get tourists without having a monarch, but that's another matter. But anyway, these people believe in the monarchy, the British Empire, and they voted to leave when they had the opportunities. You had those two groups. Who are the people who voted Remain, which is 48%? By the way, the latest polls, here's the latest poll, was to vote leave, 50, to stay in, 50. And who are the people who voted for Remain? They are mainly young people in the big cities where there's every sort of nationality, every sort of colour, race and religion. Everybody mixes together in London, in Manchester and so on. They can see no particular reason to leave the European Union on the grounds that we're going to keep out certain people. And they don't really understand they don't see anything about EU regulation. They have an image that the EU means international unity and solidarity between European people, and they don't want to lose that. They don't want to feel that they're not connected to Portuguese people or Spanish people or Italian people. These young people, these are the people who voted Remain, and the City of London, big business, who wants to continue to exploit us all in the most effective way. So it's a complicated equation. Both sides have certain points for voting the way they did. And that is why Britain is split down the middle, and now the Parliament can't decide what to do.
Na essência, o que ele disse foi que a Grã-Bretanha está dividida porque quem votou para sair da União Europeia são as classes empobrecidas do Norte e as classes ricas com saudades do Império do Sul, e quem votou para ficar são os jovens cosmopolitas das cidades e o setor financeiro. E que há bons argumentos de ambos os lados, e que o que significa neste momento, a razão por que o Parlamento está bloqueado é porque de facto existe uma base social nos dois lados e a Inglaterra está dividida face à questão do Brexit. Michael, all this Brexit, Trump, the opposition between China and America, inequality, everything became prominent in the debates after something very important that happened in our lives, and one of the most important things that happened in the last 150 years, which was the 2008 crisis. Can you explain us what happened in 2008 crisis and what is this crisis? Because there is a huge confusion between overproduction, subconsumption. Crises are expected to... When is the next crisis?
This is my speciality, by the way, in economics. So I was waiting for this question because this is what I specialize in.
The name of his blog is The Next Recession. So it's always...
So I think about this question all the time. We talked about how capitalism had the dark side of inequality and the good side of a massive expansion of production and life expectancy. There are two sides to the thing. I'm a great supporter of what is called Marxist dialectics, which is thinking about the two sides of everything and how it pans out. And there are two sides here to capitalism. And but one of the dark sides, perhaps more important even than inequality, is the fact that the capitalist modern economy for the last 250 years, as it's expanded across the world, has increasingly had every 8 to 10 years or so what we call a crisis in economics. Now, you may have or I may have a personal crisis when I fall out with my wife. Other people may have a social crisis for various reasons on their conditions and their health and so on, or their relations in the neighborhood. So we know what the word crisis means. It means a big downturn in everything that was going well before. So an economic crisis is when the economies have a big downturn when they appear to be going fine. And this happens in capitalism, not just once in a blue moon, but every 8 to 10 years or so there is what we call a slump. What do we mean? Production falls, investment falls, unemployment rises, and we seem to be in the totally ridiculous position where there are factories and warehouses and offices waiting, sitting there, ready to produce things, and there are all these millions of workers out of work sitting over here ready to work, but nothing's happening. How is this possible that this takes place every 8 to 10 years? And worse, as Raquel says, in 2008, it wasn't just the usual slump. I say usual, just think about it. Every 8 to 10 years, approximately, the major economies have these slumps, these downturns in production, stock market crashes, banks failures. In 2008, we had a humongous collapse where every single country, I'm going to ask you a question in a minute, which countries didn't have a collapse, and there are only two, that a massive collapse in production. So the output, the national output that you, if you're working, produce for everybody, went down by between 5 or 10% for nearly every country. Investment fell. That's investment in new factories, new warehouses, new technology, everything. That fell by 20% in just a year. The trade between countries fell by 30% in just 1 year. It's a massive, massive slump. And as we know, all the banks across Europe and America started to go bust and had gone bust. This was resolved by all you people very kindly handing over your tax money to the government to bail out the bankers and make sure that they didn't lose any of their money, and they were re-established as CEOs of those banks on their very nice salaries and bonuses, with the occasional tut, 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 don't do that again thing. And so you continue with your austerity and your cuts in your public services to try and keep down the debt, which was raised dramatically by all the governments to help the banks out. And why? Because they didn't want the banks to disappear down a complete hole and everybody in the economy to go down with it. So there was a conflict. So we had this massive crisis, which a huge slump in 2008. Why do these crises happen? Well, let me tell you a little story. In the middle of the crisis, the Queen of England, who's quite an intelligent person, went to the London School of Economics. That's like our big centre of international economists, where we're all very clever in the London School of Economics. And she got to the door, and she was greeted by all the professors with looking very smart and very attentive. And she came in the door, and the first thing she said, before they even opened their mouths, was, "Why did this happen?" They all jumped back 10 feet. I'm not joking, this is real. And we'll let you know. 3 days later, they published a letter, and they sent it, open letter to the Queen. And it goes blah, 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 blah. But basically, we have no idea. That was their conclusion. Other people say it was an act of God. Well, yes, in previous crises were an act of God. Famine, plague, wars, hurricanes. But this isn't an act of God. This was man-made. This is the way in which the economy is organized by people and who controls this economy and how they organize it, which is caused. It's a man-made crisis. It's not an act of God. No.
I believe Soviet economists named these cycles contraction.
Yes, well, we could discuss that you could say these cycles come in a long period, say of 50, 60 years, as the Russian economist suggested this, Kondratiev, and it's certainly, I think, I have sympathy to this view, but it's part of the process of understanding that. But there are many people in the mainstream who really have no idea. They concluded, for example, another group concluded, this was a special meeting in the United States Congress, and they said, what's the reason for this 2008 crisis? And somebody said, well, it's a chance in a billion. It's like a meteor coming down and hitting Earth. In other words, it's impossible to know. We can never know if it's going to happen again, so we have absolutely no idea. Now, this is very upsetting for me as an economist, because economics is about studying why these things happen and what's likely to happen. And if all our top economists, the Nobel Prize winners, the people who sit in the big universities, have absolutely no idea why we had a slump in 2008 and why there might be another one and when it's going to be, this is very, very worrying, isn't it? What is the point of us economists? No point at all. So I spend a lot of time about this. There are lots of arguments. Lady over here suggests one argument that presented there are cycles. Kondratiev presented these cycles take place under capitalism over a long period due to changes in the innovation that's taking place. Things take a long time to innovate. You start off with an idea, then you get a scientific discovery, then you develop a product, and then it spreads across the world, and suddenly Apple is everywhere. These can take 50 or 60 years, and those cycles can actually create conditions for downturns when the cluster of innovations comes to an end. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that, and often presented in economics, is the reason for the crisis is that people are just too reckless, too risky. Bankers are too reckless, too risky. If we regulate them, then it won't do it again. Well, there's a certain element of truth in that. But why are they reckless and risky every 8 to 10 years? Why suddenly does it go down so badly? Why are they suddenly so risky and reckless? What happened to make them so risky and reckless in 2008 when for the previous 30 years they hadn't been risky and reckless? Again, it doesn't seem to me a real answer to what's going on. Another argument is, well, the reason we get these slumps is because you workers don't get enough wages. If we paid you twice as much, you'd spend more, and then we'd all have growth. Well, yes, that sounds good, doesn't it? Certainly does sound good to us if we all doubled our wages tomorrow, and this would solve the world's economic problems. But there must be something wrong with that idea, because otherwise it would have been implemented. It would be pretty easy to implement, to say everybody can have twice as much wages. So why isn't it implemented? Because, in my view, there's a struggle going on between what we get as wages and what the owners of the means of production get as profit. This is a money-making profit economy, and if you boost wages by doubling them, you're going to cut profits. And then the owners of the means of production who have these profits will say, we've got less profits, well, we'll have to tighten up, we'll have to close down the factory or the office, or we'll have to stop our expansion in Asia and bring it back to Portugal. Or we'll move from Portugal to Asia because it's cheaper. We'll do something which actually makes it worse. So actually, there's a struggle going on in the money-making, profit-making economy. And what is crucial, in my view, this is my view, is what's happening to profits decides whether there's a slump. And I can show you the evidence that when profits goes down, when profitability weakens across the board, then you get a slump. So, and this appears to happen on a sort of regular and recurring basis. Profitability rises, capitalists compete against each other, they squeeze the workers as best they can, they introduce more technology which costs them money, and as they're competing against each other, the profitability of each capitalist begins to decline despite their efforts to raise profits. This is a contradictory, it's a dialectical thing. There's one side and the other side. And then you get the downturn in the profits, and then you get the slump. And it apparently happens on approximately 8 to 10 years. One more point then. Okay, which two countries didn't have a great slump in the Great Recession? Anybody? China. Australia. Why Australia? Where do they export to? China. What do they export? Their iron ore, their coal mines, their everything in the ground. They send it to China, who makes a lot of stuff and sends it to us. And China didn't collapse because as soon as there was a crisis, they massively increased investment through the government. They said to the banks, which they own, they said to the banks, we want you to give money to all the industry. I don't care whether you lose money, just give it to them. I mean, they said to the industries, and the still state industries about 40%, they said to the state industries, produce more, not less, invest more, not less. And by this process, they kept the economy of China going, even though their trade was declining. And they managed to maintain a faster, they didn't collapse, they actually increased their rate of growth during that period. So that is where it failed. So the profit-making economies went down, and those economies that control their investment and production didn't.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I have to make a last question, which now I put two questions together.
Not Brexit again. Not Brexit
time
again.
For one, so I put the two of them together. Why such a system that periodically brings crisis to a huge number of people in society, workers, small companies, even big companies can fall apart in a crisis. Why such a system is so durable, why capitalism continues so strong and has no opposition or no successful opposition. And my second question is about, of course, the working class, because we have heard that labor has disappeared, but when we look to the figures worldwide, the working class is growing. And I was reading a UNESCO inquiry in England, And 60% of the people in England, they declare they belong to the working class. 60%, 60%. So this is the last question.
The last of three questions. And how come capitalism's lasted so long? The answer could be even longer. But if we're thinking about the history of capitalism, it's really a short time. It's only 250 years. Now, I know that most of us don't live 250 years. I will, but the rest of you will not. But 250 years in the history of human society is nothing. Feudal society, which is where the aristocrats and the landlords had serfs on the land, lasted for over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire lasted for about 800 years, or Republic and Empire together, the slave society of the Roman economy, 800 years. So 250 years is not very long. Now, I don't want to be pessimistic about this, that if we do manage to get immortality through being frozen together, we come back in another 250 years and find that capitalism is still with us. Things are much faster now. The technology, everything's changing much faster. The way in which economies are being organized are changing. We haven't discussed, unfortunately, the big change that's happening in this 21st century, the rise of robots and automation, which will replace all of our jobs, possibly, over the next part of this century. That issue. So things are moving very fast. So I don't see capitalism lasting another 250 years, for another reason, too, that these crises that we've talked about briefly, for whatever reason, are intensifying. We will have another one. It will be another downturn. Can you imagine after we just get out of this one, we enter another one, even if it's not as bad as the last one, still one that drives a lot of people down into poverty and into bad conditions and so on. And this will be periodically happening. So it's not going... If capitalism solved this issue of crises and inequality, then it could possibly go on forever, because after all, it's working. But it isn't. It's not working. And it won't work. So that the people will begin, each generation will begin to realize how this situation has not... The importance of history, by the way, is to have a memory of what we have learned from the past to understand what is likely to happen in the future, so that we can pass that on, so that people can be better prepared for what is likely to happen in the future. So those are the things. The other big thing, as Raquel said, is that, in my view, it's working people that change things. They change society. If you look at the history of human society, things don't really change. And then suddenly there's a massive change, like a revolution or a transform thing. Portugal knows this only too well. Even in our lifetime, the massive change that can take place as a result of revolutionary change, a very quick change, made by the majority of working people. And as Raquel says, it's often said in the sophisticated circles of the universities that there is no working class anymore. Everybody thinks they're middle class or affluent and all the rest. This is not true, of course. First of all, most people still work. They have to work for a living. Even the better off people have to work for a living. There are very few people who could say now, well, I've got so much money coming through on profits and dividends and interest and my rents from all the people I've got, all those tourists I've got letting out the flats here in Lisbon. I've got so much money, I don't need to work at all. There's not many of those. Less than 1% of people who could work are in that position in most countries. 99% have to work at least to some level, and vast majority, 60 or 70%, have to work really hard for not much. So they're still working people. And then globally, the working class is massive. It is hugely bigger. Not here. It's not European. It's not American. It's Chinese. It's Asian. It's Latin American. It's African. You know, which is going to be the biggest working class by the end of this century? Africans. Nigeria is already 360 million people. By the end of this century, it will be over 750 million people. It will be way, way bigger than America, way bigger in population. These are massive changes that are going to take place over the next few decades, which creates a completely new situation for capitalism to deal with, a hugely different young population, which threatens the ability to continue with this system. Yeah. Work? Well, that's a tricky one.
The problem is that I have to do some order here.
I finished my work
because
today.
We really are running out of time. I'm sorry about this, but we have specific indications from the Centro Cultural do Bem because to respect working time hours of the people that work here, I'm sorry I cannot let you do some questions, but maybe personally Michael can answer to some of them.
As long as it's not Brexit.
Then I have to take you to a wonderful Portuguese dinner in order you can live 200 years.
Well, yeah, so life expectancy is trouble.
Muito obrigada a todos. Eu peço imensa desculpa de nós não termos tido um espaço para questões, mas realmente o nosso tempo está muito limitado e podíamos de facto continuar a ouvi-lo durante muito mais tempo. Esperemos que ele em breve seja editado em Portugal e que volte. Muito obrigada a todos. Thank you, Michael.